therapy. He might suggest acupuncture. He might suggest a chiropractor. But some doctors just write you a prescription, not knowing what your medical background history is or not knowing whether you're an addict or not knowing whether you might have not conducting his business. It's called corresponding liability, where a doctor's supposed to do his job first. He's supposed to delve into your background as much as possible to make a determination as to whether or not you are a risk for abusing these drugs. But a lot of doctors aren't doing that because, once again, the bottom line is money.
Sure.
And we as a society, we have to understand that unlike other drugs, unlike other what we might want to call street drugs, these drugs are controlled and manufactured by the good guys. Exactly. That don't have our best interests at heart. So if you're a parent, if you're a big brother or sister, or if you're responsible for having these drugs in your possession, you have to understand and realize, just because a doctor says you need to take this or you need to take one every 4 hours, doesn't mean you necessarily have to do it. So we have to be our own patient advocate. We have to be our own medical advocate and understand that these drugs are nothing to play with, because it could be your son. That could be that one person that takes this drug and all of a sudden now is taking heroin because he's now that type of individual where the drug is controlling him and he's not controlling the drug. Once again, there's no way to determine how any drug is going to affect any of us as individuals. Nobody can make that determination.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Well, before we go any further, let me remind our listeners, you can call in live if you have any comments at 702-425-4713, 702-425-4713. We'd love to hear from you, or you can chat live with us. We always want to hear what you are thinking. Professor Adkins, one of the things that you said earlier was it became popular. And how does this happen that all of a sudden, now I know opioids have been around for a long time, but how is it that all of a sudden now last week we were doing heroin. The week before that we were doing angel dust. Now we want opioids. How does that happen? And you've been fortunate to see it from the perspective as a DEA agent. I was in law enforcement for 25 years, and we've seen these trends happen. But from a clinician's perspective, how do we get to this point where all of a sudden now we've got a new fad that comes and we're not prepared for it, and now we're always playing catch up? How does that happen?
Well, that's one thing that, once again, the government will say that they're concerned with mental health, and they're concerned with drug addiction, and they're concerned with rehabilitation, and they want to put monies towards treatment and rehabilitation. In my humble opinion, they really don't.
Okay. Why is that?
Because that's not where the money is. That's not where the money is. That's not where the fame and glory is. The criminal justice system, when you say crime doesn't pay, crime pays. And to arrest people for using or being involved with substance abuse or substance manufacture, that makes money and brings glory to the criminal justice system. It's an unfortunate thing for me to say in 2019 after 30 years of law enforcement. But the government has yet to prove to me that they have people's best interests at heart when it comes to substance abuse. They've yet to prove that to me. They've proven to me that they'll put a foot forward to make arrests. But when it comes to substance abuse, and you talked about how we got here, well, it's really hard for me to define a substance abuser's mind, somebody who's apt to use drugs for recreational purposes. It's hard for me to define that type of mind. You're not like that. I'm not like that. But there are a lot of people out there that are like that. And talk about trends and fads and things like that. Yes, I came up in the 80s where crack was the drug on the street. And then the 90s, it was heroin. It was South American heroin, not Southeast Asian heroin, but South American heroin. And then we started seeing ecstasy. And down in the mid-90s through the early 2000s, we started seeing a huge boom with prescription drugs. And we haven't stepped back since. Now, people have been abusing prescription drugs forever. Certainly. But we really started to see a huge influx with a myriad of different types of prescription drugs, and we haven't stepped back yet. But why do people gravitate towards opiates? Why do people gravitate towards heroin or crack or alcohol? I don't know. Is it more available than ever before? Yes. Or have they found ways to get their hands on it more often now? Then yes. Also, the label of taking an oxycodone pill compared to snorting or injecting heroin is a lot. I don't know the word. It's not as bad to pop a pill as it is to snort heroin in the back alley.
That's a great point.
Because that comes with such a negative that comes with such a negative connotation, and unfortunately, these young people who just haven't learned yet, what they don't realize is when you start abusing these narcotic analgesics, these opiates or opioids, because of the effect it has on the brain and the body, and this is what I try to teach, and this is an exact science. The effect it has on the brain and the body, eventually there's a very good chance not only are you going to gravitate to heroin because it's cheaper, you're probably going to gravitate towards injecting heroin because of the route of administration, the mechanism of action on the body and the brain. And what they don't realize when it comes to withdrawals, injecting a drug into your vein is the most efficient way to get a drug to the brain. So it may start with recreational use of Vicodin or opiates, and you're crushing it up and snorting it because the euphoria is going to be better. But eventually, you may not be, because of the downturn in your life. Now you've lost your job. Now you're no longer in school. Now you can no longer afford those expensive prescription drugs. So now you gravitate towards a $10 bag of heroin, which is the same type of drug. And you may start snorting it. But eventually there's a very good chance that you're going to start injecting it. And that's that dangerous, vicious cycle with that classification of drugs, of narcotic analgesics, or you might want to call it opiates or opioids.
Well, you raised a couple of very interesting points, particularly with the perception angle. I remember years ago, and you may recall, one of the more high-profile incidents involved Rush Limbaugh when he was, abusing pain pills. And, now when you look at this, when you're using these prescriptions and you're abusing them, you're technically in the same category as somebody that's doing crack and all the other things, just from the illegal use perspective. However, the perception was like, oh man, that's terrible. His knee is hurting. The dude needs some help. That's what we need to do. Let's get him some help. And then when you look at the perception of JoJo that's at Sheriff Road and Eastern Avenue in Fairmont Heights, and or in Sea Pleasant rather, and it's like, let's throw him under the jail. He has enough heroin that's about the size of a piece of heroin that's about the size of your fingernail, and we want to put him away for like 300 years. So again, how did we get to that point, Professor Adkins, to the point where we've got drugs that can do equally as devastating things? They can be addictive. They can take you out of here. But on the one hand, if you've got this fingernail-sized portion of heroin, we're going to throw you under the jail.
It's a way of vilifying. It is a way of the government vilifying certain classes of people. It is the government's way of legally vilifying and classifying and indicting and convicting certain classes of people. We know why drugs were made illegal. Back in the mid-1900s, heroin, or I should say opium, marijuana, cocaine, were made illegal because of immigrants coming to this country to help build and establish this country. Asians, Mexicans, African Americans were taking jobs away from whites, building railroads, et cetera, et cetera. So whites, just like today, what they did back then, they took those three drugs because opium was very common with the Asians, Mexicans, marijuana was very common with the Mexicans, cocaine was very popular with African Americans. So what they did is they classified those drugs. They made them illegal, not because they were harmful or addictive. It had nothing to do with it. They classified those drugs and made them illegal to hopefully get those three classes of people who are using those drugs a way to arrest them and get them out of the workforce. That's why drugs were made illegal. It had nothing to do with the fact that they were dangerous and or addictive.
Wow.
And that's what they do today. That's why I say the government doesn't have your best interest at heart. We have to have our own best interest at heart. Like Brett Favre, there's been a million people that have fallen prey to narcotic addiction, where it started as back surgery, like you said, knee surgery, et cetera, et cetera. And we can easily not vilify them by saying, oh, woe is me. They need treatment. They need rehabilitation. But you're absolutely right. It's gone beyond using the medication for medicinal purposes to using it recreationally because you're addicted. But they'll take a drug like crack coke. You remember Reefer Madness?
Sure.
That boring movie, it talked about how it vilified marijuana, the propaganda, how it vilified marijuana and made it seem like it did things to people that marijuana never really does. And how it vilified black people who smoked marijuana. Any person who was black who smoked marijuana automatically wanted to rape white women. People actually believe that ignorant stuff. People actually believe that ignorant propaganda. DEA to this day classifies marijuana as a hallucinogen. Nobody smokes weed to hallucinate. It's not a hallucinogen. But that's the propaganda that we have created, the good guys, I call them, and people have fed into, and they believe. It's just a way of classifying people. That's all it is. Putting people in certain categories so that we could either vilify them or judge them in some way. That's all it is.
Sure. And let me take it back full circle for a minute. We talked earlier about the different categories of people that are impacted, and you said it impacts everyone. Is there a certain age group that it impacts more than others? Are you finding it in your research? It's more prevalent among high school kids, college folk, 50-year-old males. What are you finding in terms of that demographic?
Well, this actual, if we're talking about I'm going to call it opiate, I'm going to call it by the correct term, opiate epidemic, is affecting people of all ages, because now we're starting to see young kids. The average age of first-time drug use in the United States is 11 years old. That's the average age of first-time drug use. The studies also show that if you don't use a central nervous system drug by the time you're 18, there's a less than 5% chance you ever will. If you haven't consumed alcohol by the time you're 22, I guess they take college into consideration, then there's a 5% chance you will never consume alcohol. Wow. Whatever. My point is that with the 11, 12, 15-year-old kid, it used to be cigarettes and alcohol. And then we started seeing weed pop up as a first drug of abuse. Now we're seeing pills pop up as a first drug of abuse to include the opiates. Okay? But this affects people all the way into their 70s and 80s because what? People are living longer.
Sure.
And a lot of people are in acute pain, chronic pain, and they're being prescribed these drugs. So this actual drug is affecting people from the youth to the elderly. Sure.
Well, you raise a good point. And once again, though, let me shout out the number. If you want to talk to us, and particularly, man, I'm tongue-tied tonight, man. I'm going to have to stop drinking this syrup.
Promethazine with codeine, that's another narcotic analgesic.
That's right,
brother.
Man. I got to stay away from that Vicks 44. If you want to reach us, give us a call at 702-425-4713, 702-425-4713. And, one of the other things that I wanted to ask you, Professor Adkins, was when you look at the symptomology, and you talked about that earlier. What are those symptoms that a mother, father, husband, brother, whoever, employer should look for? If they see them, they need to be concerned and start activating the help protocols or whatever they think is appropriate.
Outward symptomology. Well, narcotics are the only category of drugs that will constrict the pupils. And in long-term use, you will start to see someone's pupils become constricted. I've seen it before. It's weird, one of the weirdest things, but that's one of the outward symptoms. But
sure,
if you're talking about a parent and a child or an employer and an employee, you could look at change of habits. You could look at change of hygiene, change in the way they dress, change in their energy levels. And one thing that central nervous system drugs do across the board is affect people's eyes. Okay. Every drug from cigarettes to heroin affect people's eyes. You could always tell if you're trained like I am, and I'm a trained DRE, but for people who aren't, you can always tell by looking into someone's eyes what drug or drugs that they're using. So if their eyes start to look abnormal to you, and then once again, if this is your child that lives in your house under the same roof, I would like to think and or believe that you're paying attention to this child. So if their eyes start to look a little bit strange to you, then that should be a concern. The change in friends. a change in the way they go about their schoolwork, whatever it may be. The lethargy, they